Wyoming Territory. Autumn of 1884, the wind had teeth that morning, and it bit deep when it blew down from the hills. Glenna North stood at the edge of the porch, her black skirts pushed by the breeze like they wanted to fly her away. Her eyes were red. Not just from the cold, but from crying hard and full, the kind of crying that leaves your bones aching. She clutched a letter to her chest, the paper tear warped and crumpled at the corners. The word deceased was all she could see now, even with her eyes closed. The cabin belonged to Canaan West, a man she had barely spoken to since arriving in the valley 5 years ago with her husband. He had helped build her barn once, then kept to himself. Folks said he had come from Texas, left something behind he would not talk about. But today, when the wagon wheel broke on the way back from the post and she slid to the dirt with her grief, it was his porch she had walked to. She had not even realized her feet were moving until she was standing there. Canaan was sitting in a wooden chair, coat open, hat tilted low. Quiet but not cold, he saw her and stood slowly, one hand resting on the frame of the screen door. "Come sit with me," he said, voice low like it knew something about pain, "and I'll never let you go." She blinked at him. Her hands trembled. She took the step up, then another, and sat down beside him, not close, but close enough. "They buried him outside Cheyenne," she whispered. "Said they could not bring him home." He nodded, slow and steady. "I am sorry, Glenna. I did not even know he left town. I thought he was going to Laramie for horses." Then the telegram came. Canaan looked out toward the ridgeline. He did not ask questions. He did not press her. He just sat beside her as the wind moved across the grasslands and the sky stretched wide and cloudless. After a while, Glenna caught her breath. "I do not know how to tell her. My daughter, Pearl, is only 6. She still waits by the fence every night." "You will not have to do it alone," Canaan said. She turned toward him, brows pulled. "Why would you help me?" He met her eyes. "Because no one should have to carry something like that by themselves." Pearl had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fire, clutching a small wooden horse. Glenna knelt beside her. "Pearl, honey, I have something to tell you." Canaan stood back by the door, hat in his hands, his presence quiet but solid. Glenna's voice caught, but she kept going. She told Pearl the truth, every word. The girl did not cry at first. She just looked down at her hands, then up at the flames. Then she asked, "Will he still see me from heaven?" Glenna nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, every day." Pearl leaned into her mother's arms then, and Glenna held her, rocking slow. When she looked up, Canaan had stepped outside, giving them space, but he had not left. That night, after Pearl was asleep, Glenna walked out onto the porch again. The wind had died down. The stars were out. Canaan was on the steps, whittling a piece of wood with his knife. "She will be all right," Glenna said softly. "She is strong." Like her mother. Glenna gave a small smile, the first in days. "I do not feel strong. You are still standing, are you not?" She dropped down beside him, not on the step below, but the one next to him. Their shoulders nearly touched. "He was not a cruel man," she said after a while. "But he was, distant, always chasing something, land, horses, work. I do not think he ever really saw me." Canaan did not answer right away. He looked at the shape forming in the wood under his hands. It was starting to look like a horse. "Then he was a fool." Her breath caught a little at that. "I see you," Canaan added, voice so quiet it barely reached her. "I always have." Glenna looked down at her lap, then at him. "Why did you never say anything? You were married. And now I am not." He looked up at her, the porch light catching the tired lines on his face. There was something honest in his eyes, something warm. "I do not believe in chasing what is not mine, but if you tell me to stay, I will." She did not speak for a long moment. Then she reached out and her fingers curled around his. "Stay." The next morning, Glenna found him in the barn, helping Pearl feed the chickens. The girl laughed as the hens flapped around them, and Canaan handed her a basket with practiced ease. "I told her she could ride my old mare sometime," he said when Glenna stepped in. "She will like that," Glenna said. Pearl ran to them, tugging at Canaan's coat. "Can I show him my drawings later, Mama?" Glenna nodded. "Of course." She watched as her daughter ran back out to the yard, then she stepped closer to Canaan. You are good with her." He looked down at his hands. "I never had children, but I always wanted to." Glenna touched his arm. "She is already asking about you at breakfast." That made him smile just the smallest bit. "I do not want to rush you. You are not." They stood there in the golden morning light, the smell of hay and dust and chicken feed around them. Glenna had not expected this. Not so soon, not after so much sorrow, but there was something steady in Canaan. Something that made the world feel less sharp. And in that moment, she realized grief did not always mean the end. Sometimes it was the start of something else. Something better. And maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough to reach for it. The first frost came 3 days later, silvering the valley with a quiet sort of beauty that made the world seem hushed. Glenna rubbed Pearl's hands by the stove while the girl blinked sleep from her eyes. Canaan had arrived just after dawn, a crate of dried apples in one arm, a coil of wire for the broken gate in the other. He didn't knock anymore. Pearl had started calling him Mr. West with the solemnity of a preacher, and Glenna hadn't corrected her. "Can I help string the wire?" Pearl asked, hopping down from the stool, boots still unlaced. Canaan set the crate down and crouched beside her. "You can hand me the nails. But only if your boots are tied proper." She dropped beside him, tongue caught between her teeth as she fumbled with the laces. Glenna watched them from the table, hands wrapped around a tin cup of chicory. The scent of wood smoke from the fire clung to her sleeves. She hadn't lit a lantern the night before. She'd sat by the hearth instead, staring at the flames long after Pearl had gone to bed, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the shutter. "You ever fix a gate with a 6-year-old?" Glenna asked once Canaan straightened. He tilted his head. "Not yet, but I reckon I'll learn." She smiled, a flash of it, worn but real. They spent the morning repairing the fence, Pearl skipping from post to post with a pocket full of nails. Glenna worked beside them, sleeves rolled to her elbows, arms scratched from the bramble she'd cleared to make room for the new line. When the last length of wire was drawn taut, she leaned back and brushed her hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "You've done this before," she said. Canaan nodded, hammer still in his hand. "Spent a year running fence along the Canadian River. Land was rougher than this, lonelier too." "You weren't always alone, were you?" she asked, drawing her coat tighter as the wind picked up. "No," he said, steady, "but folks I rode with didn't stay long. One way or another, most didn't make it past the next trail." She didn't ask what happened to them. There was a finality in the way he said it, like a door closed quiet but firm. They walked back toward the house together, Pearl chasing a stray chicken across the yard. Glenna's hair had come loose from its braid. She didn't fix it. At the porch, she paused. "I've been thinking about the east field," she said. "It'll need turning before the ground freezes. I've got a plow team stabled. I could bring them down tomorrow." She looked at him. "You do all that?" "I'm not offering charity." "I didn't think you were." He touched the brim of his hat. "Then yes, I'd do it." Inside, Pearl had pulled her quilt over the rug and was pretending it was a boat. Glenna knelt beside her and started folding laundry from the basket near the stove. Canaan stood just inside the door, hands clasped behind his back. "I can't pay you," she said after a moment, brushing lint from a collar. "I'm not asking for that either." She folded another shirt, slower this time. "What are you asking for?" He stepped forward, his voice low but certain. "Time." "That's all." She looked up, eyes searching his. "I don't know what I'm ready for." "You don't have to know, just let me be near." Pearl tugged at her mother's elbow, holding out a drawing scrawled in charcoal, 3 stick figures, a horse, and a crooked little house. "Who's this tall one?" Glenna asked. "Mr. West," Pearl said proudly. "He's helping us." Canaan crouched beside the girl and studied the drawing. "Is that my horse or yours?" "Yours," she said. "Mine's got a ribbon." He looked toward Glenna, and though neither of them spoke, something passed between them unspoken but understood. When he left that afternoon, she walked with him to the edge of the yard. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the brittle grass. He didn't reach for her, but he lingered. "I'll bring the team at first light," he said. She nodded. "I'll have coffee on." He hesitated, then added, "It's good to see light in that house again." She looked away toward the hills. It's strange. I didn't think it ever would. He started down the path, boots soft against the dirt. She watched until he was a silhouette against the slope, then turned and went inside. Pearl had fallen asleep on the rug, her drawing still clutched in one hand. Glenna lifted her gently, settled her in the bed, and covered her with the quilt. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty, not anymore. The plow team came before sunrise. Glenna saw their silhouettes first, two thick-shouldered bays moving slow behind Canaan, their breath rising in white clouds. She opened the door before he reached it, apron already tied over her dress. He tipped his hat, not smiling, not needing to. I boiled the coffee, she said. I'll take it black. She stepped aside and let him in. Pearl was still asleep, her drawings from the night before scattered near the hearth. Glenna poured 2 cups and handed him one. I've never worked oxen, she said, watching the steam rise. They move slower than horses. But they don't quit, she nodded. That sounds familiar. He didn't answer, but he watched her hands as she wrapped them around her cup. Her fingers were red from the cold, raw in the creases. He swallowed the last of the coffee and set the tin cup down. I'll take the east side first. Soil's softer near the creek. I'll bring you a meal around noon. He paused before stepping out. That'd be welcome. She watched him go. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she moved to the stove and stirred the oats she'd set out. Pearl wandered in half awake, hair tangled, dragging her quilt. There's a man with a hat in the yard, she said. I saw. Is he staying? Glenna knelt and tied the girl's braid with a short strip of calico. He's helping. Folks don't usually help us. Glenna paused, then kissed her daughter's cheek. I know. Pearl ate without fuss. Glenna packed bread, cold beans, and a wedge of dried apple into a tin and wrapped it in cloth. She carried it across the field just past midday. The earth smelled of roots and turned loam. Canaan walked behind the oxen, reins looped behind his neck, hands steady on the plow's handles. His coat was tied around his waist, shirt damp with sweat. When he saw her, he called a halt and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. You've got good timing, he said. I was guessing. He took the tin and sat on an overturned bucket near the fence line, legs stretched out in front of him. Glenna knelt in the grass, smoothing her skirt beneath her. You always this quiet when you work? She asked. Talking don't make the furrows straight. She leaned back on her hands. You ever think about leaving this valley? Used to, but I'm tired of chasing what don't hold still. She looked down at her knees. I thought that too. Until I realized I was the one always moving. He peeled a piece of apple with his knife, the blade catching the light. What kept you? Pearl, and the land, and maybe the way the wind smells after it rains. He nodded slowly. That's a good reason. She watched him eat, the steady rhythm of his hands. Do you miss Texas? No, I left it for a reason. He glanced at her. I don't go back to what I already buried. She didn't ask more. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of cedar and damp earth. A pair of crows flapped over the ridge, their shadows passing over the field. Canaan stood and stretched his back. I'll finish the west side before dusk. Glenna stood too, brushing her palms on her skirt. I'll have stew ready when you're done. I'd like that. She turned to go, then stopped. What did you do before you took up with the land? Rode cattle, broke horses, spent too long sleeping under the wrong roofs. Were you ever married? No, she nodded once. I was 16 when I said yes. Thought it meant something bigger than it did. Sometimes a name don't hold the weight folks think it should. She stepped back, her eyes on the far hills. No, it doesn't. Back at the house, she found Pearl in the hayloft, feeding crusts to the barn cat. The child's boots swung from the edge as she hummed a tune Glenna's mother used to sing. You're not supposed to be up there alone, Glenna said from the ladder. I'm not alone. There's Miss Whiskers. Glenna climbed up and sat beside her. The cat blinked at them from the shadows, then tucked itself tighter into the straw. Why don't you like town? Pearl asked. Glenna picked a piece of hay from her skirt. I don't like the way folks look at us. Because Papa's gone, because they think they know things they don't. Pearl leaned against her shoulder. Mr. West doesn't look like that. No, Glenna said softly. He doesn't. They sat in the loft until the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods. That evening, Canaan washed his hands at the pump while Glenna ladled stew into bowls. Pearl had set the table with mismatched spoons and a lantern that flickered more than it lit. The three of them ate in a silence that didn't feel hollow. After the dishes were stacked and Pearl was tucked into bed with her quilt pulled high, Glenna stepped out to the porch. Canaan joined her, arms folded, breath visible in the cooling air. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said, watching the stars gather. "You don't have to earn safety," he said. "You just have to not run from it," she turned to him. "I haven't run, not lately. You've stood longer than most would." She looked at his hands, calloused and still, resting against the rail. "You said something to me that day I first came." "On your porch." "I remember," her voice dropped. "Say it again." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Come sit with me and I'll never let you go." She stepped closer, not needing to be asked this time, and when he reached for her hand, she gave it freely. The last of the cottonwood leaves dropped in the week that followed, scattering gold across the yard where Pearl played with a length of twine and a pine cone she'd turned into a pretend calf. Glenna watched from the doorway, sleeves rolled to her elbows, soap drying on her hands. She'd been boiling linens all morning and her back ached from leaning over the washtub, but she didn't call Pearl in. The child was humming something tuneless, lost in her world, and Glenna didn't want to break it. Canaan had come early that morning and was still working near the north fence, where a corner post had rotted through. She could hear the steady rhythm of his mallet, wood on wood, like a heartbeat somewhere just out of sight. He hadn't said much when he arrived, just offered her a wrapped parcel of smoked venison and nodded at the frost gathering on the trough. He was like that most days. Present, but never assuming. And somehow, being near him made the world feel less sharp around the edges. She'd never known quiet to feel like comfort before. Pearl wandered up the porch steps and leaned against her mother's skirts. "Can I ask him if he wants to see my new drawing?" Glenna wiped her hands dry on her apron. "After supper." "He'll be tired now. Do you think he ever gets lonely?" Glenna looked down at her daughter. "Why would you ask that?" "Because he doesn't laugh much, but he always listens." She bent and brushed a curl from Pearl's cheek. "I think he's learning how to be happy again." "Same as us." That evening, after Pearl was asleep and the candles burned low in glass jars, Glenna brought out a wool blanket and stepped onto the porch. Canaan was sitting on the top step, nursing a shallow cut along his forearm. Bits of bark clung to his trousers, and his boots were dusted white from the chalky soil near the creek. "You should have let me wrap that earlier. Didn't want to drip on your kitchen floor." She sat down beside him, laying the blanket over both their laps without asking. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when I don't feel the pain." She dipped a cloth into the cup he'd filled from the pump and gently wiped the blood. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the muscle beneath it still tense. "You ever think about building something of your own?" she asked. "I used to. Had a piece of land near San Saba. Drought took it, then rustlers took what the drought left." She folded the cloth and started tying a strip of muslin around the wound. "You never tried again?" "I figured the land wasn't the problem. I was." Glenna frowned. "That doesn't sound like a man who keeps promises. And you've kept everyone you've made to me." He flexed his fingers, watching the knot she tied. "Maybe I just needed the right reason." She didn't speak for a while. The stars were faint above them, and a coyote called from somewhere past the ridge. She leaned her head against his shoulder slowly, as if testing the shape of the moment. "I never used to sit outside like this," she said. "My husband always thought it was wasted time. I reckon quiet's never wasted. You make it easier to believe that." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You know you could have asked me to leave any time." "I didn't want to, I know. I just wanted to hear you say it." She turned her face toward his, close enough to see the edge of a smile begin behind his beard. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You think we could build something here, not just survive it but make it real?" He didn't hesitate. "If it's with you then yes." She took his hand and laced her fingers between his. The porch was cold now, the blanket barely holding the chill off, but they didn't move. "I don't want Pearl growing up thinking love is something you have to earn by being quiet," she said. "She won't. Not with you showing her different. And you," he looked at her, then out across the slope where the land darkened into night. "I'll show her what it looks like to stay." And Glenna, who had spent too long learning the shape of absence, let herself believe him. Not because of the words, but because of the way his hand never let go. The ground held a thin crust of snow by late November, crunching under boots and wagon wheels alike. Canaan led the team down from his cabin one morning, hauling a load of seasoned firewood Glenna hadn't asked for but needed all the same. He found her in the shed, sleeves rolled and shoulders hunched, oiling the hinges of the root cellar door. She didn't look up until his shadow fell across the threshold. "Stacked it by the fence," he said. She wiped her hands on a length of flour sack cloth. "I'd offer you coin, but I reckon you'd just hand it back." "I would." She set the cloth aside, brushing sawdust from her skirt. "Pearl's at the schoolhouse today. Miss Loring offered to keep her the afternoon." He stepped back, giving her space to come out into the light. "That the woman with the pins in her hat. She's the one who thinks sugar is a sin unless it's in her own tea." Canaan chuckled, a quiet sound that lived low in his chest. "I've known that kind." They walked toward the house together, wind rising sharp off the hills. Glenna opened the door and stepped aside for him. Inside, the stove already radiated heat and the smell of dried sage hung in the air. She moved to the counter and poured 2 cups of boiled coffee, handing him one without speaking. He sipped, then looked around. "You've made this place yours." "I didn't have much choice." "No, but you chose how." She looked down at her cup. "You ever wish you'd done things different? I used to think on that. Then I figured there's no sense in measuring a man by what he didn't do." She leaned back against the counter, watching the steam curl up from her coffee. "Pearl asked me last week if you'd stay here if we asked. What you tell her? That I didn't know your mind. I've been thinking about that." She turned toward him, eyes steady. "And? I've had my name on a deed before, but it didn't feel like this. I get up in the morning now and know where I'm going, who I want to see. That's not something I take light." He set his cup down, then stepped closer. "If you'd have me here not just to help, not just to fix things, I'd stay. You and Pearl, you're not a stop along the trail. You're the end of it." Her voice caught, but she didn't look away. "I don't need grand promises. I only need to know you'll be here when the snow melts, when the roof leaks. When Pearl gets her heart broke for the first time, I'll be here for all of it." She reached up and touched his jaw, fingers gentle. "Then yes, I want you here." He leaned down, and when their lips met, it wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss built slow over time, made of every quiet shared hour, every unspoken gesture that had come before. Outside, the wind rattled the empty branches, but inside it was warm. Later, they sat by the fire, her feet tucked beneath her, his hand wrapped around hers. He told her about the old ranch road he used to ride, the one that twisted through pecan groves and crossed a dry creek twice. She told him about the first time Pearl had spoken a full sentence and how it had stopped her dead in her tracks while hanging laundry. They talked until the candles burned low, until the world outside faded into stillness. And when the house creaked beneath the weight of winter settling in, neither of them moved. The wedding took place 2 weeks before Christmas. It was a small gathering. Miss Loring, the millwright and his wife, and a handful of neighbors who brought jars of pickled beets and cornbread. Pearl wore a red ribbon in her hair and held Glenna's hand the whole time. Canaan stood tall in his cleanest shirt, and when he spoke his vows, he didn't read them from paper. He looked Glenna in the eye and said them plain, the way a man says things he means. Afterward, they shared stew and fresh bread in the cabin Glenna had made a home. Pearl fell asleep with her head in Canaan's lap, and he stroked her hair like he'd done it 100 times before. Glenna watched them from across the room, heart full in a way she didn't have words for. That night, after the last lantern had been turned down and the wind had quieted, Glenna lay beside Canaan beneath the patchwork quilts her mother had sewn. His arm was around her, steady and warm, and she could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing. "I never thought I'd want to marry again," she whispered. "I never thought I'd find a place that felt like mine." She turned toward him, her hand resting over the slow thump of his heart. "You were always meant to find us, and I always will." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. Spring brought green back to the valley. Pearl learned to ride the old mare, and Canaan stood at the fence each morning, watching her with arms folded and a quiet pride in his eyes. Glenna planted potatoes behind the shed and hung fresh linens by the creek. They built a new chicken coop together, and every evening they ate with the doors open, the scent of wild grass drifting in. They didn't speak of the past because they didn't need to carry it anymore. What they had now was enough a life built slow, with hands that knew the shape of work and hearts that knew the shape of healing. And through it all, Glenna never stopped reaching for his hand, and Canaan never once let go.